Thank you very much. I now have the honor and privilege of introducing our first keynote speaker. We have 5 keynote speakers for this conference, which I thought was very interesting. It might be a British way of organizing conferences, because usually, you know, there's a keynote and then there's other speakers. But we are blessed with 5 keynote speakers, and it is, I think, symbolic of the collaboration and the partnership and the kind of high level of dialogue that people are coming here expecting and committed to. And just a little bit about Caroline. There is a short bio in your program, and your program has also descriptions of the workshops that will follow for this weekend, and there is a lot of thought put into how to present these ideas. And our conversations with Caroline and David Brazier and Greg Creech and Clark Strand and Dijak, who started over 2 years ago, and it's been a journey, and Caroline has actually come here a couple of times, and we have gotten to know her work and been able to present little workshops on it, and I have had the privilege of going through some of her books, and these are available in the bookstore as well as the works of the other speakers today, and I really urge you to check them out because it's really valuable in all of our work and in our personal lives. So I really highly recommend it, and I feel like I have gotten to know Caroline's work over the past 2 years, and I'm really excited that we're able to share it on this level. She is based in Great Britain, in Leicestershire, with the Amida Trust, which is a Pure Land community, and that's an interesting story in itself. You might ask her about during tea times and the breaks. And she is the head of their psychotherapy training program, which is quite elaborate. And I think that the amount of work that they have developed along with David Brazier, who is also our keynote, is just a gold mine of experience and lessons for us to share and think about here in this country and in each of our works. So without further ado, let me have Caroline come up here and start the evening in earnest. Thank you very much. Caroline?
Thank you very much, Yumi. Well, I want to start by writing up that saying from Shinran. Which Reverend Umetsu just quoted. We are not alone. Because I think in many ways that is the essence of other-centered approach. You know, maybe I should just step down at this point. But you see, I mean, I think that this is a very profound teaching. I actually had an experience of just this phrase about, goodness, 8 weeks ago this weekend. I was staying at our retreat center in France, and I'd been to visit a friend for Christmas Day, and on Boxing Day, I drove back to our retreat center. I was on my own. I was staying in the house on my own. I was in the car on my own. And just as I was driving up the little hill towards our retreat center, there was a lot of ice on the road. It was it had been a very cold night, gone down to -10 degrees centigrade, which I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, so you probably haven't a clue how cold that is, but that's pretty cold. And that little bit of the road had been in the shade and hadn't thawed. And so when I tried to get the car up the slope, it just wouldn't go. I kind of got up the slope, and then it slid back, and I got up, and it slid back. And about the third time, as I was sliding back, another car was coming towards me. And I thought, oh dear, I think I'd better just stop here in the curb and wait for this other car to go past. And I thought, well, I'll just nip out the car and just kind of wave to him and just let him know what's happened, kind of thing, and why the car's on the wrong side of the road and stuck in the verge and so on. So I opened my door, stepped out the car, and next thing I knew, I was flat on my back. I couldn't move. You're lucky to see me upright here. And it was like I was lying there on the road, terrible pain in my back, could not get up or anything. This guy in the other car stops the car. We're just on this little tiny lane out middle of nowhere, just kind of two houses, our house, another house, and the farm beyond, and nobody beyond that. So quite a miracle at all that anyone should turn up. And then next thing I know, there's another car arrives. Another guy gets out. So suddenly I'm lying there on the road, can't get up. There's these two guys stood there. And they're kind of saying in French, kind of, do you want, what should we do? Should we call an ambulance? Are you all right? Kind of thing. And I'm kind of lying there saying, well, kind of like, this hurts. And I'm kind of testing out my rather inadequate French, trying to explain that I'm in a lot of pain and I can't move and I can't get up. And I'm not usually the sort of person to make a fuss, but on this occasion, I'm going to make a bit of a fuss. And anyway, they eventually go off and get my neighbor, and my neighbor comes down, and the three of them get me up to the house and take me into the house, make me a cup of tea, sit me down, phone up the medical services. Medical services say, take an aspirin. I'm kind of like, oh, sure. Yeah, okay. I don't think that's going to do this. And anyway, to cut a long story short, these three people, they help me back to my house. Between them, they drive my car back up. They get it up the hill in spite of me not being able to. And they've got an ambulance out. I'm taken to the hospital. I'm sorted out. And suddenly, as I'm lying there in the hospital, it's like it just comes to me. You know, here I was, lying on the road, all on my own. And just from nowhere, all these people are there helping me. I'm not alone. You know, I couldn't have done it myself. And at that moment, I was just completely flooded with tears. I just felt so much depth of gratitude for the fact that, you know, at that moment when really I needed help, people turned up. It's like I'd been on my own in the house for a week. I'd been to visit a friend. I'd been back. I'd really been thinking in terms of a solitary retreat and so on. And then just at this moment, when I needed people around me to help, suddenly there's all these people doing all the things that I need to look after me and make sure that I'm cared for. And it was a very profound learning in the fact that I was not alone. We are not alone. It's like at those moments when life throws it at us. It's quite amazing how often what we need actually turns up, and not through any power of our own, but through some, who knows what power. I mean, you know, as a Pure Land Buddhist, I have my own ideas about that. I'm sure some of you do too. But, you know, the fact that in these moments when the crisis happens, there is support there. We do not have to do it ourselves. And this is the fundamental basis of other-centered approach. It feels like a great privilege to be able to start this conference and to talk about other-centered approach. I feel quite passionately about the whole subject, not just because it's come out of my study of therapy and my work in training therapists, but much more broadly than that. You see, I think when we start to think about what we actually mean by this, and we start to think about our modern society, our society has been greatly influenced by psychology. And I think we have to start to ask questions about that influence that psychology has been having in the 20th century and into the 21st century. But particularly, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, I guess I'm getting a bit old here, really. You know, I'm thinking back a few decades, and, you know, there has been so much influence. I've seen so many changes in my lifetime. You see, I think that psychology in the 20th century, it's had an impact on our thinking in many different ways. I think it's particularly influenced our approaches to things like education and child rearing, for example. It's influenced our approaches to things like marketing. It's influenced our approaches to business and organizations. It's influenced our approaches to politics and so on. And if we think about, like, what does modern psychology, how does it view the person, then I think what we tend to get is two models that predominate. I think we have one model which is really saying that the person is in some way in danger of being damaged, that they're subject to various traumas in their life, that the human being is fragile. You think about, like, some of the approaches in education, for example. You know, when you look at the legislation that is around children, there is a lot that is very necessary. You know, a lot of the child protection legislation, for instance, that's come in over the last 30, 40 years is very important. And at the same time, I think there is something of a tendency to lean so far that, in fact, we're almost implying that we don't do anything for fear of damaging people. You know, that there has been such a backlash that people are afraid, you know, that you can't touch a child these days, for instance. So if a child falls down, you can't cuddle that child. You know, if you're a professional working with them, for example. You know, how, actually, what does that do to children? There's a lot of fear of children going out to play outside. You know, how many children are actually kept indoors or taken to school by car by their parents because there is a fear that something awful will happen to them. You know, there is this constant fear of damage that is going on. And I think it influences a lot of our practices. And so it's like the human being becomes viewed as something which is fragile and something that needs this kind of protection. And then also alongside of that, you also have this view of psychology which views humans in rather a mechanical sort of way, as in some ways being able to be fixed, a sort of fix-it mentality to psychology. And so this would be the kind of approach which saw it as, well, if you just take this set of procedures, then the person will turn out right and they'll be healed or whatever. So, you know, you've got this emotional trouble, well, you need to follow through this set of particular procedures, whatever, and you'll then be cured. And so I think you have this sort of dichotomy in psychology in the West, both of which point towards a sort of normative model, a model in which human beings are processed and produced at the other end as being kind of okay, ready for the world, and fitted to society. One of which tends to point them in the direction of being functional and able to fit in as, in a way, parts in the sort of machine of society, in doing a useful job, and so on and so forth. The other of which sees them as in need of protection in case they, in some way, get loose. And and I'm thinking particularly of the sort of idea that we in some way contain something rather dangerous that might be unleashed in society if we're not actually protecting ourselves and each other from these sorts of psychological forces that might erupt. I think both of these views of the human, and I'm painting very broad brush here, have tended to be quite limiting on society. I think that there are other factors which are quite, in a way, ignored by this. And one of these, of course, is the dimension of the spiritual, which I think has also been an important factor in the development of psychology, but something which has been pushed into the background. And I want to just kind of mark it up at this point, because I think that although there is a sort of division made between the therapeutic and the spiritual realm, in fact, I think that the two are completely linked together, and it's impossible really to talk about one's psychology and one's mental health without thinking about the spiritual dimension. I think one also has to take into account that modern psychology in many ways took on the role in society that the spiritual has taken on in the past. And I think when one looks back to the very early processes, to people like William James, Freud, and so on, that they were very much drawing on the spiritual tradition, which has then, in a way, gone underground in psychology. So when one looks at these sort of roots of psychology, one's looking at the different sorts of forces which have contributed to our modern sense of the person and to the construction of a lot of the kind of ideas that are around in society. And some of these have been very positive influences, some of them have been rather less positive. But I think one has to ask, what is the sort of basic message that psychology is giving? What's the kind of message on which we're building our therapeutic processes? And more broadly, what's the kind of basis that this gives us to looking at humanity in general? Because as I said earlier, I think that psychology has not just influenced therapeutic process, I think it has also had a big influence on many sectors of society, the way that we think, the way that we approach global problems, the way that we approach social problems. It's like on all layers of society, psychology has had an influence. And so the type of psychology that we're talking about has to be looked at, and the kind of underpinnings of that psychology have to be thought about if we are going to look at and understand, like, what it is that we're actually building our society upon. What's the value base on which we're constructing things? I said that I'd been thinking back over the last few decades, and I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the sorts of trends which I felt had been maybe significant in the last 30 years or so. Things which I see as being maybe problematic in the culture, and things which I've seen developing. If I kind of think about my own experience, going back to, say, the 1980s. In the 1980s, I was a young mother. I'd given up work. I was living at home. I was somewhat bored with my life. And I started to look around me for new things to get involved with. Basically, I decided I'd moved to a new part of the country, and I didn't have a lot of friends then. And I was stuck at home, feeling very frustrated with the fact that I'd got 3 young children at the time and was sort of up to my elbows in nappies and caring for children and doing lots of domestic things, and thinking, well, I didn't get my degree to wash diapers, that's what you call them over here. That was not what I got my degree for, kind of thing. So I thought, well, what can I do? And several of my friends were starting to get involved in community activities. So I said, okay, yes, I'll come along. I got involved in things. I started to get interested in various groups that were going on. I started to go along to personal growth groups and things. And this was very much the time when there were a lot of kind of exciting things happening. You know, you could go along and find out who you were. You could find out, you could sort of do all these different exercises in kind of exploring your life and understanding your true nature and discovering what legacy you'd got from your childhood and all this sort of thing. And I spent quite a lot of years going along to all these groups, finding out all about who I was. And it was a very exciting process. And, well, I mean, this sort of thing is infinitely fascinating. And I'm sure some of you have spent many years delving into yourself and so on. Little did I know, I was past the me generation. So So, yes, I mean, this was a whole trend that went on. There was a lot of interest in me. Another trend that I've noticed has changed a lot has been the whole business of consumerism. I mean, I probably don't need to say an awful lot about the growth of consumer culture. I was talking the other day with somebody about the way things have changed. And I was saying, like, for instance, in my family, we didn't even have a refrigerator until I was 8 years old. I remember it being really exciting because a friend of the family bought a new refrigerator, you know, a new one. Amazing. And she gave us her old one. And we were able to put orange juice into boxes in the refrigerator and freeze it into ice cubes and eat it. And wow, this was just so exciting, you know. And like we didn't have a television set until I was about the same age, about 8 or 9. You know, we used to go down to a friend's house to watch The Lone Ranger, you know, down the road on a whatever Friday night or whenever it was on. You know, it was like those sorts of things were really exciting. And yet, over the last, well, you know, I can remember people walking around with these boxes kind of talking in the street and thinking, you know, they look crazy. They're just walking up the street talking, you know. Who hasn't got a cell phone these days? Email, computers, you know. My first computer was one that you built yourself. You had to get all these bits and solder them together and so on onto a board. And it was really exciting. And you could get it to do little sums and things. Well, yeah, I mean, it would add sort of 3 and 4 and things like that. And you'd go, wow, that machine just did it. Slide rules. Yes, we used to have slide rules when I was at school. Yeah, anyway, you know, we can all play reminiscing, but consumerism, so much more stuff in the way of goods, so many more things. And, you know, and these days, you know, I look at my kids, the things they have in their houses compared to what, you know, I mean, my first house, we had furniture made out of orange boxes and things. We used to find the orange boxes from the market and put bits of wood on them to make shelves and that sort of thing. You wouldn't catch my daughter doing that, you know. I mean, standards have just changed completely. You're going to move it over, okay. And following on from that, soundbite communication. You know, how do we talk to one another? Faster. You know, I mean, I can't do it here because my phone won't pick up here, you know. Did you know that? European phones don't work in North America. So I can't text my daughter anymore. You know, but when I'm at home, we're texting to and fro all the time. You know, just sort of, how are you doing? What are you doing tonight? Going out? Kind of thing. You know, I mean, it's like sentence here, sentence there. Complete change from how it used to be. You know, I used to write letters, for goodness sake. My parents still write letters. You know, they haven't even got an answer machine on their phone. But, you know, the younger generation never heard of a letter, never heard of a stamp. And then our society thinks a lot about systems and rules. You know, this is something I've seen happens a lot. I mean, we arrived here on Monday night, had to queue up, go through immigration. Well, I mean, you used to have to kind of show your passport when you arrived places. Then you used to have to fill in a form and get a card. Now you have to go online before you even come anywhere near the place. You know, if you haven't been online and filled in your questionnaire with the, whatever they're called, immigration people over here, then, you know, they won't let you in. And they charge you for it these days. They've even put on a charge since last year. I got in last year, so I'm all right. Till next year, anyway. But, you know, it's like everything we want to do these days, you've got to fill in a form. It gets more and more complicated. And I talked earlier about, like, why don't we let our children out? Because we're frightened. You know, I think one of the things that has happened a lot in our society is that we've developed what we sometimes refer to as a fear culture. That people have become a lot more anxious about a whole lot of things. You know, people worry about child abuse. They worry about, well, over here, I guess they worry about guns. Thankfully, we don't have many guns in Britain, but, you know, in Britain, people worry about knives and mugging and all that sort of thing. Probably doesn't make a lot of difference. But, you know, people live a lot on fear. And it's fed, of course, by the media. People read the newspapers, they read the stories about the things going wrong. They have a lot of... They're actually stopped from doing a lot of things they might otherwise do because they're terrified of things that might happen to them, which probably won't, but they might happen. And so we won't take the risk anyway. So we have a fear culture. Okay, well, I'm sort of going through some of my favorite prejudices about society today. But I think you'll recognize the kinds of things that I'm talking about and the sort of changes that lie behind them. But I'm partly talking about these for a reason, because, you see, I want to come back to psychology, and I want to come back particularly to Buddhist psychology. I want to talk about, like, what does Buddhism have to say about the human condition? Well, the first thing that Buddhism has to say is that we live in a situation where we have a lot of what's called dukkha around. Suffering, affliction, problems, difficult things, things that go wrong in the world, impermanence, sickness, old age, death, all those sorts of things. So we're living here in a world which has plants and trees and other people, lots of other people. Because we're not alone, you see. We're living there, but this world is a world where there's a lot of dukkha around, a lot of suffering, impermanence. So how do we cope with this? How do we exist in this world? Well, what Buddhist psychology says is that basically we put ourselves into a bubble. We create psychological bubbles for ourselves. And most of the teachings of Buddhist psychology are really about how that bubble is constructed. And I'm not going to give you a long lecture on Buddhist psychology tonight. You'll be pleased to hear, or maybe not. But broadly, this bubble is constructed out of what we refer to technically as attachments. Like we basically hook on to various things in the world and we use them. And we create this illusion around ourselves of a kind of permanence. And we refer to that illusion as being ourself or identity. So we basically create ourselves a little bubble of self, which is our protection against the world, and we do it out of attachment, and that attachment can be a positive attachment, we call that greed, or it can be negative attachment, we call it hate, or it can be mixed up ambivalent sort of attachment, and we call that delusion. And we're very hooked on this process. Basically, it's a process of addiction. It's a compulsive process. So what we tend to do is we tend to use all the things around us as props for this process. So, we might be surrounded by all these other people. Well, we don't relate to the people themselves. We kind of use our kind of images of the people. And we use our images of the world as an image of a tree and an image of a flower and things like that. So we sort of surround ourselves by our view of the things, hooked in by greed, hate, and delusion, as ways of kind of protecting ourselves. In other words, to put this in sort of everyday terminology, what we tend to do is we tend to distort our experience into our own prejudices, our own assumptions, our own selective view, all these kinds of psychological ways in which we create our personal world, which is our little bubble, which we inhabit. And that stops us from having to see all the greed, hate, and delusion, all the reality, the impermanence, sickness, old age, and death that's out there in the world, because that's much too scary and much too dangerous. And so if I go back to my prejudices, this is a bit of my bubble, really, then I think you can see that actually most of these actually have some relationship with the creation of bubbles. So that, well, for example, the interest in me, well, I said me was absolutely fascinating because this is all to do with self and identity. Oops. Different color pen. So, of course, we're very interested in this because this is all to do with creating this little world of self. And so we can go endlessly into this. And, I think this is a lot of appeal of some of the therapy culture that's around, is that we can spend years and years and years investigating ourselves. Consumerism. Well, here I think we're getting into sort of greed territory, I think you'll agree. Soundbite communication. I think, again, there can be bits of all sorts in this, but probably there's bits of greed in it. But I think it also has a lot to do with compulsiveness. The sort of being hooked into the cycle, and I've got to do it kind of feeling. I remember listening to a program on the radio recently when I was, it's like when you're stuck in bed with a bad back, like I was for a few weeks, you spend a lot of time listening to the radio and things. And I was listening to a very amusing account by a woman of how her family tried to give up technology for a month and what happened. And she was talking about her addiction to her iPod and so on. And, I think a lot of these, or her iPhone rather, and, a lot of these things are very compulsive. I've got to communicate, I've got to communicate, I've got to communicate. I think there's a sort of, it's like we get addicted to it. Systems and rules. Well, I think this whole process here is really one of increasing rigidity. It's like what we're afraid of, actually, is the unpredictability of the world. We're afraid of impermanence. And so we're trying to create a sense of permanence. And often what we end up with is rigidity. And this is the psychological problem. And then fear. Well, of course, this is probably in the realm of the kind of hate modality of being. And so, I think when we look at these sorts of trends that I think there have been around in the last 20, 30 years, I think we can see that these sorts of processes of self-building here, which create the protective bubble that we all live in, they're going on not just at the individual level, but also at the social level. And so I think when we start to look at psychology and we look at the effect of psychology and so on, we have to look not just at, like, what does it do for us as individuals? We also have to look at what's the psychology of our society? What's our collective process? How collectively are we creating this bubble for ourselves? And of course, when we start to think of it on this collective level, then we start to realize that this is not just about individual identity, it's about collective identity. And this idea of a retreat into collective identity through greed and through hate, how does this manifest? Well, it manifests in things like patriotism, like identifying with one's country or one's class or one's social group, and hating other social groups and social classes and so on. And so, I think we can see that in the last decade or two, these sorts of processes have been happening a lot in the world. And a lot of the problems of the world actually come out of these very same processes of greed, hate, and delusion that we see on the individual level in the therapy room. And so one then comes to the question of, well, what's driving all of this? Why is it that people are frightened? What is it that's going on in the world that is problematic? And I think when one starts to ask these questions, then one starts to realize that actually there are a lot of forces going on in the world that are indeed problematic. One can certainly look at the conflicts that are around in the world. One can look at the fear that has been engendered, and we all talk about 9/11, but there are many sources of fear in the world, and I think that is just one step in a long process. But certainly the conflictual situations that are going on, I think, are feeding this process, which is leading to a social stagnation in society. But I think more than this, I think we are coming to a point where the human race is beginning to come up against its own experience of impermanence. And I think we are all, whether we like it or not, being faced with the fact that we are vulnerable as human beings, that our planet is vulnerable, that our world is a much smaller world than we used to think it was, and that there are not places to disappear to as they used to be. I mean, it used to be that when things went wrong in society, one got in a boat and one went across the sea, And being in North America, probably most people's ancestors here at some stage came across the sea from somewhere else as an escape from somewhere. But it isn't possible anymore. We were just reading the other day that it looks as if it's going to be very difficult for human beings to actually escape into space because of the problems of reproducing. Because apparently to be pregnant in space, any baby that was conceived in space or was carried through a pregnancy in space would end up sterile because of the radiation. And so the idea that one can just send a spaceship full of people off to another planet and have them reproduce there and settle down and everything go hunky-dory looks as if it's actually a very, very long way off and much further off than we thought it was. So we're stuck on this planet with all the environmental problems, all the problems of resources running low, all the problems of conflict and warfare and so on. All of these things, we've got them for keeps. And so either we face up to them or we create our little bubbles through these processes of greed, hate, delusion, addiction, and so on. Well, it's not a very good prospect. And so I think, we have to ask, well, what's the alternative? What is this other-centered approach that we're talking about? What does Buddhism have to offer? Is it something that can contribute? And here I wouldn't want to say that we have the last word at all, but I think what I would want to say is that we need to look in different directions and we need a plurality of possibilities. I think that the existing modes of operating that we've used, they're letting us down. We're not finding answers to these questions. We're not going to find an answer through some sort of fix-it answer which normalizes people back to the norm of what they've been so far, because it ain't good enough. We haven't come up to the mark. Human beings are destroying themselves on their present journey. We're not otherwise going to find it by looking into ourselves and identifying more and more trauma and reasons why we've been hard done by and why we're having a bad time. Because there isn't anybody out there who's actually going to make that any better. You know, it's not like there is some great parent who's going to say, never mind, dear, it's all okay now. We've got to face it. We've got to take responsibility. So what do we have? Well, this is where I come back to the original statement from Shinran. We are not alone. Because you see, other-centered approach is really about the fact that we might have created this bubble here, but actually what the bubble's doing is it's cutting us off from the very thing that we need, which is other people, other things, other places. Mental health is a function of how we connect. Our mental health depends on the way that we connect to others and the way that we connect to our environment, the way that we connect to growing things, the way that we connect to those things which make our life what it is. Mental health is a function of understanding that we are part of a bigger system, that we're not on our own, that we don't have to do it all ourselves, and indeed that we couldn't possibly do it all ourselves. That actually we are dependent, and that's all right. We do not have to be independent. We can depend. We do depend. You know, everything we do, we depend. We depend on others for our food, we depend on others for our clothes, we depend on others for this room, for the chairs we're sitting on, for our medical attention, for our transport, for everything. And that's just the human others. We depend on the air, we depend on the warmth, we depend on the sun, we depend on the earth. We depend. We are completely dependent beings. And it's through recognizing that dependence, through feeling the gratitude that is natural when we recognize that, that we appreciate these bonds and these connections, and we learn some respect for them. And it's out of that respect that we move forward. And if we are to find a way out of the mess that we've created, this is the way that we will do it. So this is why I'm passionate about other-centered approach, because I think it gives us the foundations by which we can start to reach out from our little bubbles, to reconnect, and to see new ways of being. And so in this conference, I hope that we can explore some of these things. I know that we have ahead of us a couple of days of very exciting presentations. You know, I mean, I've talked about gratitude to some degree, but I know that Greg will be talking some more about the whole area of our dependence and our gratitude and in his presentations. We have a natural need to care for one another and to reach out. And I know that David will be talking about this and has written about the whole question of how we learn to love others and how, in our attempt to love, out of that imperfect attempt, civilization, arts, all the things that we value have grown. I've talked about the way that the self is constructed and the way that we try to relate to others out of that construction. And I know that Daijaku will be talking somewhere in that sort of area. And Clark, I know you will be talking about the environmental questions and the whole business of addiction and so on. And so, I think that, maybe I've cast some of the subject areas that we're going to be touching on. But I hope that maybe I've also given you a sense of just why it is important that we look at this subject. Yes, there are methods that come out of this which can be used in the therapy room, and I spend a lot of my time training therapists, teaching people how to work with methodologies that help them to engage, whether it's in terms of their relationship with other human beings or whether it's in terms of environmentally based therapies. But I think we're talking about something which is much bigger than that. I think we're talking about something which touches on all of our lives in all of the contexts in which we are. And I hope that we can take the discussion in this sort of direction, because I think that other-centered approach has to address not just the therapeutic, but the therapy for life and all that we do. So thank you very much. I'd like to, at this point, open up to questions, but also maybe, as this is the first presentation of the conference, this is also an opportunity for you to, if you have things that you want to say at this point, which maybe can be addressed through the remainder of the conference, then it's also an opportunity for any kind of introductory comments that people would like to make. So thank you very much.